Hey guys, and welcome back to Gap Grace Point Online. Today's lesson is part of our Stand Up series in August as we look at how God calls us in all situations and in all places to stand up for what is right and how God gives us the courage to do exactly that. Today our lesson is called Not Gonna Bend My Knee as we look at how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to stand up and not bend their knee to the forces that were trying to get them to bow down to something they did not believe in. Let's have a look at what today's lesson is all about. Sometimes in our daily lives, there are things that try and influence us and try to get us to do things even though we know it's not right. Back in the time of Daniel, remember that we're looking at the story of Daniel, and today, especially Daniel 3, verse 1 to 30, we can see a time where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were being influenced to do something they didn't believe in, but they had the courage to stand up and not to do what the people were asking them to do. Remember how towards the end of the Old Testament, there were a group of people that were taken from their hometown as captives into Babylon. Now, in that town of Babylon, there was a king that was called King Nebuchadnezzar, and he decided one day that he was going to build a statue of himself. This wasn't just any statue, it was the biggest statue that he could build in that time. One of the largest statues actually built in the Bible, and it was made of pure gold. When the statue was built, the king called all his officials and all the people as part of his crowd and his followers and said that when the music started to play, they had to fall down and worship this statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. Imagine being anywhere in the city, hearing music start to play and having to go there, fall down on your knees, bow down to this idol and worship. You see, King Nebuchadnezzar did not believe in our one true God that we believe in. Instead, he believed in the other gods and almost made himself a god by creating an idol, this statue, which he said people had to worship. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decided they were not going to do this. They were going to stand up for what is right because they believed in the one true God. The God that had said to them, "Do not bow down before idols. Don't worship any other gods before me." At that point, the officer of the king decreed that anyone who did not worship the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar when the music started to play would be thrown into a fiery furnace. When the music started to play and the three men stood up and said, "We will not bend our knee to the statue of the king," they were threatened to be thrown into the fire. The music started to play again, and the king stood and watched to see if they would bow. And they said, "We're not going to bend our knee. We will not worship you." And so the king got angry and he flew into a rage and he had them thrown into a fiery furnace. A furnace is like a huge bonfire where they would create a fire to kill other people. These three had the courage to stand up and not to bow down to the statue. And the king became so angry at this, so he ordered for the furnace to be made 7 times hotter than normal. 7 times. It was so hot that the soldiers that were tying up the three men to throw them into the fire were burned to death by just standing close to the flames. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into this fire. And the king thought that would be it. They disobeyed me, and now they are dead, and people will worship me again. Suddenly, the king looked into the fire and saw there were 4 men standing in the fire. So he says to his officials, "Hey, didn't we throw 3 men in? And look, there's 4 now, and one of them even looks like a god. And didn't we tie them up when they were thrown in? These 4 men are walking around free and not tied up, and they don't even look like the fire's hurting them at all. This 4th man looks like a god." So King Nebuchadnezzar shouted into the fire, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the true God, come out." They came out of the fire, and they didn't even smell like smoke. They were not burned, their clothes weren't burned, they didn't even smell like smoke. How crazy is that? They were protected by God because they had the courage to stand up for what is right. Then the king praised the one true God and declared that from this day, no person will be allowed to speak evil against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the God that we believe is our one true God. From that day on, King Nebuchadnezzar even believed in God. He recognized that there was only one God and that this God had saved these 3 men from the fire because they had the courage to stand up for what is right. Every day in our own lives, we have situations where we have to have the courage to stand up for what we believe in and for what God says is right. Sometimes it's by disobeying when other people say we have to do the wrong thing. We have to obey God and have courage to do the right thing. Sometimes we feel afraid to do what's right, but we have to trust that God will be with us, protect us, and give us this courage to do what is right. We need to stand up for God and what God is asking us to do. The most important thing we can choose to do is to obey God by becoming His child and following Him in everything we do. Our memory verse for this week comes from Acts 5, verse 29 in the New International Version Bible, the NIV. We must obey God rather than men. Remember that men here is the word that's meant as humans. So we must obey God rather than humans. We should always have the courage to stand up and do what God is asking us to do, not to be influenced when people ask us to do other things. That is not what God asked us to do. Don't forget, like always, there is a resource link in the comments below where you can click and it'll take you to today's resource on the website. There you can complete the reflection activity and really get into the material of what today's lesson means for your life. Join us again next week for episode 3 of our Stand Up series, where God, in all places and all situations, gives us the courage to stand up for what He asks us to believe in. Bye, guys. See you next week.